Thank you, Dr. Peace, for your important testimony regarding the importance of listening to the voices. I thank the panel of witnesses today for their testimony. I remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Today, we've listened with tears in our eyes and purpose in our heart to the tragic stories of the treatment of young Native American children who were torn from their parents, torn from their families, torn from their culture, torn from their homeland, and forced into conditions that today, if you told us these stories today, we'd say it was torture. We have heard such stories. And we know that it is important to continue to hearing those stories, even as I recognize that all of you who have shared, who are survivors, that even telling the story is painful. So I recognize that pain, and I thank you for being willing to go over that pain again and again so that we know what happened and so that we can move forward. So for that, I offer my gratitude. You know, and we must acknowledge that Congress played a role in this when in 1819 we passed the Indian Civilization Fund Act to appropriate funds to church-run schools to, quote, civilize American Indian and Alaska Native children. By 1925, 60,889 American Indian and Alaska Native children were forcibly taken to Indian boarding schools. Our own country allowed children to die in federally funded schools, as we've heard today. At least 53 burial sites for Indigenous children in marked and unmarked graves exist across this country. And yesterday we heard about the Department of Interior and its report that confirmed that the United States directly used federal Indian boarding schools as a system to dispossess tribes. 76 schools were in present-day Oklahoma, 47 in Arizona, and 43 in my own state of New Mexico. The report further calls for an investigation on the legacy impacts of federal or Indian boarding schools. It's undeniable that these events have led to intergenerational trauma. American Indian, Alaska Native children experience post-traumatic stress disorder rates at the same rates as veterans returning from war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course they do. They've suffered harm as young children, torn from their families. They suffer PTSD at triple the rate of the general population. H.R. 5444 will establish a much-needed commission to formally investigate and document the stories of survivors and the human rights violations that occurred against these American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiians. This bill will also include a nationwide hotline service for survivors, family members, and other community members. H.R. 5044 will focus on the historical intergenerational trauma in Indigenous communities. Again, I want to thank the witnesses, especially the survivors here today. I have almost used up all my time because I wanted to make sure we all understood the difficulty of what you are doing and testifying here today. But Mrs. Parker, I want to just ask you quickly, what are the current barriers to obtaining records for Indian boarding school and better understanding what took place? Because I think it is important to understand those barriers so we can truly understand the purpose of the bill and some of its provisions.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question, Chair Fernández. I had the opportunity when I was younger to work in British Columbia, Canada, and we worked with the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we were funded to do so, to work with First Nations residential school survivors, also boarding school survivors from the United States. And we know from that experience that obtaining records was extremely difficult. Records didn't come forward cooperatively, and so now, after many years, I'm a citizen of the United States here, and it's time that the records come to us, to the citizens of this country, to the citizens of our tribes. As the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we have asked for records from churches, organizations, we've done a FOIA request to the federal government, and we have received little support, little information. So subpoena
with the
power,
time left, with regards to the subpoena power that the commission would have, do you believe that would assist in recovering those records?
It's absolutely necessary. It's why we worked with this bill to make sure that this information comes to the boarding school survivors and their families and tribal nations and organizations who worked for the healing and the truth of the Indian boarding school experience.
Thank you. My time has expired, and the chair will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Obalnolte.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to all of our witnesses. I found your testimony this afternoon extremely moving, and I am sincerely hopeful that this represents the starting point of a process that can bring some healing and some catharsis to the victims of this terrible tragedy, like yourself, but in tribes across the country. Ms. Parker, I'll start with you with a question. So at the beginning of the hearing, we were talking about the Department of Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And as I'm sure you're aware, Secretary Holland yesterday released the first volume of findings from that. I haven't made my way all the way through it. It's a little over 100 pages, but I perused it. And hopefully this weekend I'll get some time to read through it. But it's very moving and powerful what they've managed to uncover. And I was also very happy to hear her announce yesterday that she's going to be doing over the next year a nationwide tour to gather testimony and stories from people in Indian country about the atrocities that were committed at these boarding schools, and to try to bring some light and some healing to this process. So as the author of the bill testified, we certainly don't want to be duplicating the efforts of the DOI here. We want to have this commission be a parallel process that adds meaningfully to what the DOI is doing. Can you tell us a little bit about how this committee would distinguish its efforts from that at the DOI?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. This commission would examine beyond what the scope of the Department of Interior can do. So as we know, there's other departments and representatives in Congress and as well as churches and other organizations, private organizations who have records. And so this commission would take a dive deeper into the records and the public testimony. This will make it a formal record for the U.S. Congress and for all of us to understand the needs of our boarding school survivors, intergenerational survivors, tribal nations. And so what this bill would do is hold public testimony in a way that opens the door to also the experiences of those who attended church-run schools.
Thank you. I think we all have a common purpose here. I was actually very disappointed that we didn't have the Department of Interior here to testify on their initiative. And I'm hopeful that in the future we will be including them in this process, because I think that would be a very helpful addition. And I think we're all on the same team here. We're all working for the same cause, and I think that their inclusion is warranted. Secondly, I'd like to continue a line of questioning that Chair Ledger-Fernández began on the subpoena power that you are requesting for the commission. As you're aware, that's actually a relatively rare thing for a commission like this to have. In fact, as I think I mentioned at the onset, there are some of the standing policy committees here in the House of Representatives that don't have that power. So I am fearful, though, that if we assume this process is going to be adversarial when we go out to collect this information, that although we might be getting at the truth, we might be also delaying the healing. Can you talk about a little bit more about that particular concern? Why assume that this is going to be an adversarial process?
I guess I'm not so sure I'd call it adversarial. I would just call it the need for records and for churches and other organizations to bring their records forward. We've heard many stories that they don't have a librarian in their church that can compile all the information. We've heard a lot of reasons why we cannot receive the records. So with the subpoena power, that will allow us to make sure the records do come forward in a timely fashion. So I think a lot of this is just compelling these organizations to bring these records forward, especially because we have elders right now who are ill, and we've lost a lot through the pandemic. So we need these records now. It's critically important before we lose these stories, and our elders, they deserve to know where their relatives are, what happened to their family members.
Right. Well, we all share that goal. But I can tell you from experience that when you issue a subpoena to somebody, when someone serves that subpoena, the person is going to assume that the process is adversarial. They're going to show up with lawyers. They're going to be very defensive. I don't think that's the kind of atmosphere we're trying to lay here. And so that's my concern. We, the Natural Resources Committee, we have subpoena authority. And so I will pledge to you, and I think the chair will join me in this, that if you're having difficulty accessing records, sick us on it, because we will go after those records. And these are agencies that have to come to us for approval on their budgets, for approval on the initiatives that they're starting. We will help you get those. But I remain concerned about the subpoena authority just for that reason. But I see I'm out of time. But thank you again to everyone. It's been very moving this afternoon, and we all appreciate you being here.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Representative McCullum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you, Representative Davis, for bringing this forward. And thank you to our Interior Secretary, who was in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota this weekend, who was at the headquarters of the folks who are here trying to seek the reconciliation for children who attended boarding schools. Really quickly, before I get to the subpoena issue, I would like to address the term such sums as may be needed. As an authorizer, when I first came to Congress, that was all that was in the education bills, unless we were reauthorizing something that had a current base number. So it's custom and usage when you're launching something new to put in such sums as needed. And that's because when it goes to Ms. Pingree committee, she will have a targeted amount of money that she can spend on the interior bill. And that gives her the flexibility of balancing all the needs of Indian country within the interior bill, and making sure that she works with organizations to make sure that they have the necessary funds to do the minimum, more if we can do more, and the maximum they can spend if they can spend it at a time, and if Ms. Pingree has that amount of money there. So to have authorizers determine what the appropriating committee is going to have is a little awkward because we don't have our targets yet. So such sums as may be needed doesn't mean it's an open checkbook. It just means that the appropriations committee, which the authorizing committee can work with, can do its job in setting the budget. I'm going to hold up something. I know we're doing this virtual. This is called the Catholic Spirit. And the Catholic Spirit, and I'm Catholic, for the record, because I will be criticizing my own church. The Catholic Spirit had a big report, and it's called Special Report on Indian Boarding School Legacy. And they're going through a truth and reconciliation within the Catholic Church on this. But yet I know firsthand that my church has failed often when children have suffered at the hands of religious clergy with sexual abuse, that the church has been involved in cover-ups and slow walking. So the fact that this commission had the ability to quickly let the churches, particularly that were involved in these boarding schools, to know that they have to comply with getting these records moving forward is extraordinarily important. And this just isn't records to do reconciliation and healing. These are all records so we can honor those young students who died, who are often in unmarked graves. And that's something else I worked on in the state of Minnesota. We had a legacy at our state of mentally ill and other children being institutionalized and being buried in unmarked graves. So it was a very difficult process to move through to get the information in that. So subpoenas should be rarely used, but when used properly, they can keep someone from stonewalling a commission or a group to get to the truth. So Ms. Parker, once again, please, would you say that where there's been public money used to a Catholic church, one of these other church schools, that the taxpayers have the right, that you have the right to get that information for taxpayers and how their dollars were used in many instances to abuse, torture children, and to divide families by destroying their cultural traditions? Should it be a right to get that information for the taxpayers?
Yes, I strongly believe it should be a right to obtain those records, and we've already proven that it's been incredibly difficult to receive the records. So I would agree with Representative McCollum.
Madam Chair, as Chair of the Department of Defense Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, I look forward to working with you, Ms. Davis, and the Department of Interior to make sure that the Department of the Defense turns over every single record, because they too were involved in a lot of these schools and the way in which children were not treated with the dignity they deserved, and the families had their whole future ripped away from them. And we owe it to our tribal brothers and sisters to do everything that we can to face a wrong, to right a wrong, and to make sure it never happens again. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. The Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, and of course, and especially the witnesses for sharing their most intimate, tragic, and important stories that we need to move forward by passing this legislation that has been presented by Representative Davids. Today's hearing comes just one day after the Department of Interior released a report that reveals more about the dark history of Native American boarding schools. We know that there were more than 400 such schools and that they were supported by the U.S. government and more than 58 associated sites, a figure that could grow exponentially as research continues. Children were forced to leave their families, were renamed, told not to use indigenous languages, and many killed, among many horrors. This hearing may seem timely, especially after this report, but let's not forget that to this day, the U.S. has not acknowledged or apologized for its actions during the boarding school era. While we may never be able to bring justice to Native children killed, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policies Act is a first step towards achieving necessary measures of accountability. Questions for our witnesses. Mr. Matthew Ward-Bonnet, thank you for being here today and for sharing your story as a boarding school survivor. In your testimony, you said that the government and the churches need to be held accountable for what happened at these schools. What does accountability look like for you, and how would the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policies achieve that?
Well, thank you very much for your question. For me and my family, and if you would permit, I would like to show you a picture. And these are my sisters and my family, my siblings that went to the mission school. We all attended that St. Francis School. But to me, acknowledgement by the churches, not just an apology, but an acknowledgement of what they did to the children, and the refusal not to acknowledge the struggles that they had when they became adults, that they engaged in activities that became abusive to themselves, and as a result, they began to abuse their families. They became abusers of their communities, and until they went the churches and government must sit down and say, by acknowledging that they had a hand in this, acknowledging that these children that came to the school, they were clean spirit. And what happened to those children had a lot to do with how they were let out of that school. But to say to the children now, the grandchildren and the parents of the grandparents, to say, what can we do by acknowledging this? How can we help you today to begin to resolve these issues so that this doesn't continue to roll over into the future and future generations? How can we help you? Do we need to set up some kind of a mechanism or system whereby children can get the therapy that they need, that parents can get the therapy that they need, so they begin to understand what it is inside of them that makes life intolerable for them? That they need to look at how they can work with us so that our grandchildren can look good in the future. That they can say, this is who we are, not who they want us to be. To me, a lot of our children that I went to school with, a lot of their children are going through this misery. And they don't understand why. Instead, people look at them and say, it's your fault that you're in this situation. So we need the government to recognize that they helped in this situation. We need, particularly in this situation, because it was a Catholic school, that the Catholic Church take responsibility to those communities. I once asked the Archdiocese in Milwaukee that covers all the Catholic schools in the Dakota Territory to meet with me 9 years ago to talk about this issue. I told them that if we could sit down and come up with a plan to help our children and our grandchildren, then I would come back and work with them to do this. I met with Father Murs, who represents the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. To this date, I have not heard from them. I don't know what it will take for people to meet their responsibility. I have no idea. I would hope that the Truth and Justice Reconciliation, they would want to meet that responsibility without a lot of legalities getting in the way.
Thank you, Mr. Warbonnet, and know that I too stand with you in the efforts to get at the truth from whatever institution it needs to be obtained from. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This committee is often one that's tasked with righting historic injustices. There was a Voice of America headline, Florida Prison Fort served as testing ground for federal Indian boarding school system. The El Castillo de San Marcos, subsequently known as Fort Marion, Florida, was an abandoned Spanish fort where U.S. Cavalry Officer Richard H. Pratt, according to VOA, had the idea of, quote, how to solve the so-called Indian question, whether and how to assimilate natives to American culture. We see what our staff analysis between 1819 to 1970, during the boarding school era, more than 357 of these schools extending from Pennsylvania to Alaska came into effect. And currently less than 38% of the Indian boarding school records have been located. We know the terrible tragedies that happened, and thank you all for being here and for your stories. These stories matter, as tragic and as hard as they are to hear, and this hearing enshrines them into our shared history. and the Truth and Healing Commission by Representative Davies will help us on this long road towards justice. Mr. LaBelle, you had told us a lot here today, and it would be, if you can, important for you to go into a little bit of the abuses that you witnessed in a little more detail for the record as we work on this bill, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Almost from the get-go in Wrangell Institute, beatings began almost upon arrival. It began with children being shorn of their clothing in a violent fashion. Our clothes, many of our clothes were torn away from ourselves until we were standing naked in a room and forced to look a certain direction and march to get haircuts that were, I remember being toward the end of the room, and as I was approaching the barber, the mound of hair that was growing around his feet as we were getting closer to my haircut. We were told to march up to a open area shower room. We're still naked and we're still strangers to each other, to us boys, one from the other. And we were ordered into this open shower room where the water was already running, and many children did not or could not bathe themselves. They were as young as 5 years old. And I recall I can see matrons running into the shower, getting wet themselves, getting a floor brush and taking lye soap and scrubbing children until some of them bled, the skin bled. We were marched again into a line where we were assigned our numbers, and we all were issued 2-digit numbers that was placed on indelible ink on our clothing and on our bedding and on our mail. And many children had difficult names, so oftentimes it was easier for matrons to refer to these children only by their number and never by their name. Years later, I still remember talking with other people my age who said that for a time, I thought my name was my number. We were basically forced to eat foods that were foreign to us. We came from traditions of eating wild game, caribou, moose, seal meat, whale meat, salmon, greens, berries, and now we were forced to eat industrial sized meals that were in cans, 3-pound cans. There were like canned meats, canned vegetables. We drank canned or powdered milk, powdered juice, ate powdered eggs. These were all things that became violent in our bodies because our bodies rejected the diet. And many of us were getting extreme stomach aches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and sometimes this lasted for weeks until our bodies became adjusted to those kind of foods. We soiled our beds, we vomited, and we had diarrhea in our clothing and our beddings. Many of the matrons forced us to clean up our own messes. They did it in a lot of anger. All along the way, punishments were meted out for speaking our language. I was bilingual, as I mentioned once before, but I do know that I suppressed my speaking Inupiaq language for English because I knew if I didn't, I would get punished, as I saw many other children did. They were given the strap. They were given the 9 of cattails paddle. We were forced to run up and down gauntlets where other children whipped our naked bodies. Sometimes we had to run numerous times up and down until the matrons were satisfied that we had received enough punishment. In the classrooms, we were often put in darkened rooms and darkened closets for speaking our language. We were often put on high stools in the front of the class wearing a dunce cap, where other children would laugh and point fingers at them because they did that really thankfully that it wasn't them. At the nighttime, it was the worst, I think, for many of us. As Warbonnet said, happened at Wrangell Institute also. We started to cry when the lights went off. We cried for our parents and our mothers. And it caught on. Pretty soon, the whole dorm, the whole wing of the dorm was wailing into the night until the next day our eyes were closed shut. We could barely open our eyes. And that crying occurred days in and days out and weeks in and weeks in and out and months until toward the middle of the school year, no child ever cried anymore. And I think you know as parents that when a child cries, they're wanting love, they're wanting a sense of safety and security and assurances that everything is okay. But us children never got those assurances. And we became pretty hardened. Our feelings became hardened because we knew that to cry and to pine for our relatives was just useless. At nighttime also, it was the worst time for many young little boys who were sexually molested in their beds by matrons and by other staff on the campus. They were often also molested in the bathrooms. This Wrangell, for some reason, attracted many pedophiles. Looking back on my experiences, my 6 years there, from 1955 to 1961. And we were often warned not to tell anyone, not to tell our parents, or something bad would happen to them. Our mail was censored. I remember trying to write home telling about the abuses. And when my mom got the letter, she told me years later that a lot of my letters were redacted. I never knew what that meant at the time, but today we know that they were blacked out because they didn't want my mom to know what kind of abuses we were experiencing. In the girls' dorm, the same things happened. Many girls were sexually molested. A lot of many 11, 12, and 13-year-old girls were going home in the middle of the school year pregnant. A friend of mine was a favorite of an administrator who took her out of her classroom almost on a daily basis so that he could sexually molest her in his office. She showed me her arms, and I don't know if much of you who know anything about cuttings, but she had scars on both sides of her arms, and scars upon scars and scars. And we know that she was trying to take the pain away from the memory of all of those sexual molestations she had. It was so bad that she developed multiple personalities. She died 5 or 6 years ago, and her stories to me is just so graphic. I knew things were bad for the boys, but I also realized that the girls suffered extremely harshly as well.
Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the chair of the Committee of Natural Resources, the gentleman from Arizona, Chair Grijalva.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to convey my gratitude to you and the ranking member for having this crucial and precedent-setting hearing that we needed to have. And I appreciate that very much. And the testimony, both written and what I've heard, today is painful as it is, it's a reality. And a reality that we can't deny, you can't erase, you can't rewrite. You just have to expose and begin the process of healing, reconciliation, and understanding. And that's what this commission is about. And because we are talking about public policy that directed this nation and its entities to move in this direction, to move in the direction of 47 boarding schools in Arizona, second highest in the country, and 40 plus in New Mexico, and the list goes on. And it should not be a dark secret. It is not a secret to Indian country. And the intergenerational effect, we haven't even talked about that, but it's there. And the loss of identity on the part of who we are and a person and who these children were, it's not something that is trifle or little. It's fundamental to a community, and it's fundamental to a people. And I think the subpoena power is necessary. We're reacting to a public policy. And in order to we must have this truth seeking is not about assessing punishment. It is about recognizing that this chapter in our history is something we cannot hide from. And the survivors that are here today, thank you so much. Tribal leadership, thank you. Ms. Parker, thank you very much for your consistency on this issue for as long as you've been working on it, and all of us have been working with you. But I think, the report that thanks to the leadership of Deb Holland as secretary, and it does make a difference, her report begins the process, doesn't end the process. And I think that Congress has a role as the legitimate legislative policy setters for this nation. It's time to set a policy that moves this dark and atrocious chapter, not to forget it, acknowledge it, and begin the process of healing. And subpoena power is necessary because we're truth seekers. This legislation that Mrs. Davis, and I want to congratulate her as well, is promoting, and we all need to support, is about truth. And personal story, and then I'll yield back. My questions are superfluous given your testimony. And the urgency doesn't go away with me asking or not asking a question. The urgency has been before us for a long time to do something, and it's going to continue to be there. When I started school, I didn't speak English, and because that's what I learned at home from my parents. So I went to a school back home, and it had a particular grade that if you didn't know the primary language of English, that you were put into this class until you learned it. It was not first grade, it was something else, although we were all supposed to be in first grade. And you had a teacher that was stumbling through whatever Spanish she knew to try to teach us some words. And I remember that we kind of struggled and scratched our way out of that class, and then went to real first grade after about a year. For me, about a year and a half it took me. But I remember the Otham kids in my class whose primary language was Otham. I remember the Apache kids, whether it was from San Carlos or White Mountain, that happened to be in the city, and their families, and their primary language, essentially, was their native language. And I remember most of us Spanish speakers, most of us moved on to that first grade a year later, a year and a half later. And the tragedy that I remember, and it really struck me as stark, is when we started learning more about the boarding schools and understanding that it isn't a secret, and that had been a secret too long, is that they didn't get out of that room. They stayed there for a long time. They were then diverted to a boarding school, or they disappeared. They just stopped going to school. And I remember that in a very vivid way because those were my friends, those were my neighbors, those were my buddies. And yet we had a dual system, a system that was not only intended to isolate and remove from children their identity and their sense of self, but a system that was intended never to educate them. And I think this bill is long overdue, Madam Chair. I applaud you, the staff, the ranking member. It's a difficult one, but you know, all of us as Americans and as members of this Congress, when we have a responsibility, and the responsibility in this instance is not the question of forgetting about history, rewriting it, erasing it, pretending it didn't exist, but acknowledging it, and with the highest level of respect and candor, begin the process of healing and reconciliation. And that's where we're at. This is what this bill's about. And you can't sugarcoat the reality. You can be bold. And I think this Congress should be bold, step forward, pass this bill, and move it on. Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. And I want to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony today, for their patience. I want to thank you for being willing to share the pain and the stories and the proposals and the answers to the many questions you received today. And I think that it is important to recognize that this bill is about bringing out those stories, finding the information, getting the information you need. But it's also intended to say, what do we do next? Like, how do we address what happened in a way with recommendations of policy proposals, as Chair Grijalva said? Do we need to increase funding? Do we need to provide a better system because we are still educating Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children in our schools? And are we doing the right thing by those children, considering what we did to their grandparents and their parents? And so that this bill is more than just a truth about what happened. We always need to remember it is the reconciliation piece as well, because it is in that reconciliation piece that we must dedicate ourselves to look at how do we address the wrong and move forward in a way that truly honors the pain that everybody went through, because the reason to do this is to create a better future for all of those grandchildren and those that would come after, so they both know the truth and know that this country is dedicated to moving beyond that to yet a better truth that we will make in that future. So I thank you for your testimony. I thank the chair, and I do thank the committee staff for all the work that they did in putting this hearing together. And I will remind everybody that the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to please respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.